You ever look at your own budget, your income, your bills, and just wonder how that all works on a national scale? It's funny. How a country manages its money is kind of like how we manage ours, but also it's a completely different universe. So let's dive into the fascinating world of public finance.
I mean, it really is the biggest question, right? A government has a ton of expenses. We're talking roads, schools, defense, healthcare, you name it. So, where on earth does all that money come from? Let's break it all down.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. For you and me, it's pretty simple. We figure out how much money we make, then we decide what we can afford to spend. But the government, it completely flips that on its head. Its main goal isn't personal profit, it's what they call social advantage, basically things that are good for everyone. So it figures out what society needs first, and only then does it figure out how to raise the money to pay for it all. And believe it or not, there's a whole field of study for this. It's called public finance. It's all about understanding how governments, from the national level all the way down to your local town council, manage their income and spending. This is truly where economics and politics shake hands to run a country. All right, so first up in our journey, let's talk about spending, the expenditure side of the equation. This is all about where the government's money actually goes. And wow, has it grown? For decades now, government spending has just been on this steady, steep climb. The sheer scale of it is pretty hard to wrap your head around sometimes. To put a number on it, just take a look at this. For the 2018-19 fiscal year, the Indian government spending was over 17 lakh crore rupees. And keep in mind, that number has only gone up since then. It just gives you a little snapshot of how absolutely astronomical these figures are. So you've got to ask, what's driving all this spending? Well, it's not just one thing. It's more like a perfect storm. The population is growing, so you need more services. Cities are getting bigger, which means you need more infrastructure. Then you've got rising defense needs, big development projects, and inflation, which just makes everything more expensive. Oh, and you can't forget about unpredictable things like disaster management. It all adds up, and it adds up fast. But here's the thing. Not all spending is created equal. You can basically put it into two main buckets. First, you have developmental spending. Think of this as an investment in the future. Money for things like health, education, and infrastructure that will help the country grow. Then you have non-developmental spending. This is more about keeping the lights on. Things like administrative costs, defense, and paying interest on old debt. You absolutely need both, but they have very different jobs. Okay, so that's where the money goes. Now for the other side of the coin, public revenue. How does the government actually fill up its treasury to pay for everything we just talked about? The number one source of cash for any government is, you guessed it, taxes. And they generally come in two main flavors. A direct tax is exactly what it sounds like. It's a tax on your income or your property that you pay, well, directly to the government. You can't pass that burden on to someone else. But an indirect tax is a little different. It's baked into the price of things you buy. So a company might pay the tax up front, but they just shift the cost onto you, the customer, by making the product more expensive. And speaking of indirect taxes, you can't talk about them in India without mentioning the GST. The goods and services tax was a total game changer. Rolled out in 2017, it was this massive overhaul that got rid of a super complicated web of different state and central taxes and replaced them with just one unified system. But taxes aren't the whole story. The government has a few other ways to make money. You've got fees, for services like getting a document registered. Then there are fines and penalties for breaking the law. There's also the money from selling public goods and services, like your railway ticket. And finally, governments sometimes get grants or aid from other countries or international groups. So, what happens when spending is higher than all the money coming in? Which, let's be honest, happens a lot. Well, just like us, the government has to borrow. And that brings us to our third pillar, public debt. Simply put, public debt is the grand total of everything the government has borrowed to fill that gap between its income and its expenses. And it's not always a bad thing. I mean, it's a critical tool that helps fund huge, important projects when there just isn't enough cash in the bank at that moment. So where does the government borrow from? Well, there are two main sources. There's internal debt, which is when the government borrows from its own citizens and banks right inside the country. And then there's external debt, which is when it borrows from outside sources like the World Bank, the IMF, or even other countries. And trust me, it really matters who you borrow from. Internal debt is kind of like the country owing money to itself. But external debt, that brings in a whole other layer of complexity with things like foreign currency and global politics.
So we've got spending, earning, and borrowing. But here's the key. These aren't just random decisions. They are all carefully coordinated parts of a much, much bigger strategy for the entire economy.
And that strategy has a name: fiscal policy. Think of it as the government's economic game plan. It's how they use all of these tools, spending, taxes, and debt, to steer the economy. The whole point is to keep things stable, manage inflation, and help the economy grow. This is the master plan that ties everything we've talked about together.
And the main way we see this fiscal policy in action is through the annual budget. You can really think of it as the nation's financial report card. Once a year, the government stands up and presents this huge statement that details exactly where it expects the money to come from and where it plans to spend it in the year ahead.
Because at the end of the day, a budget is way more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a statement of priorities. It shows what we as a society really value. So now that you know the basics, here's something to think about. If you were in charge, if you held the national purse strings, what would your priorities be? What would you change?